So this video is going to be about resolution. And remember, in a previous video we talked about resolution and pixels and raster graphics versus vector graphics. Raster graphics meaning they are built out of pixels. Resolution is how many of those pixels exist within an individual image. So in this image that I have up, if I grab my zoom tool and I start to zoom in on this image, at some point I'm able to start to see the very basic breakdown level of the pixels inside this image. And if I zoom even further, they become more apparent. At some point, your image, if you go to View, Show, Pixel Grid, if that's turned on or off, you may see little white lines in between those pixels. Those white lines won't print, they're just there as a guide to show you what is and what isn't a pixel. I like to have that turned off, so I go to View, Show, and turn that pixel grid off. But in any case, these are the pixels, and how many of those pixels exist within your image is your pixel dimension, or some people like to call it resolution. So if I zoom back out of this image, or if I double click on my magnifying glass and get to 100%, what I like to find out when I open an image is exactly how many pixels I'm dealing with. So if you go up to Image, Image Size, a dialog box will open up to tell you a little bit more about what this image contains as far as the pixel dimensions. Now, this dialog box is probably one of the most important ones to understand inside of Photoshop and in this class for this matter. So you'll want to become very familiar with it and understand it pretty much completely, because it's very important to understand the makeup of your image. Because it's happened to a lot of us where we've downloaded an image maybe from the web and we printed it off and it just doesn't really look that good. And you don't want to be working on your images for hours and hours and hours, or digitally creating some sort of composition inside of Photoshop and not have done it at the right size for what your output is and have something rendered useless. So you're going to want to become familiar with what's going on in this image size dialog box. What we're looking up here at the top is, I think, the most important area, and it's the exact number of pixels you've got in your image. So in this image, we've got 824 pixels wide by 615 pixels high. So vertically, if I were to count all of the pixels or squares up along this left edge, I would get to 615, and obviously across the top I'd have 824 of those little squares. So that is the absolute pixel dimension of your image. This is pretty much the most important dimension for that matter, because it tells you exactly how many pixels you have to deal with. Now underneath it, the document size is how it's going to take those available pixels or those available squares that are in that image and how it's going to put them on a printed page. Is it going to take several of those squares and put them into 1 inch, or in this case 266 of those squares and put them into 1 inch? And if it takes 266 of those squares and puts them into 1 inch wide, then I'm going to only end up with about a 3.098 inch wide image. If I were to decide to enlarge my image or create more pixels within each inch, I'm going to need more overall squares or more overall pixels to choose from. So Photoshop may increase the number of pixels that are available up here. And if it has to increase the number of pixels, that's called resampling. And interpolation is the method at which resampling happens. The method at which, if Photoshop has to, I'm going to hit cancel, if Photoshop has to take, if I zoom way in here, if it has to take, maybe move a little bit further over so I get some differentiation between pixels here, go down to the mountains. So if Photoshop has to take these 4 pixels and create 16 pixels out of it, or if it's got to take these 4 pixels and downsample and create just 1 pixel out of it, what are the colors of those pixels, the new pixels, going to be? Are they going to be an average of all 4 of these? Is it going to pick one of the 4 and choose, or is it going to blend all of them? That's the interpolation. That's the method that resampling happens. Whether you upsample, create more pixels, or downsample and get rid of pixels, what's the method at which that's going to happen? So if I go back and double click on my zoom tool, go back to image size, and I look at my dialog box again, if I want to make sure that this image does not get pixels added or removed, I want to uncheck resample image. So I'm not going to alter my image contents at all. What I'm going to be doing now is altering how it takes those 824 pixels by 615 pixels and puts them on a printed page. So these numbers are locked in when I uncheck resample. Interpolation isn't going to happen. Photoshop isn't going to remove or create new pixels. What it's going to happen is it's going to take those pixels and I'm going to decide how they're going to be put on a printed page. So if I decide I want an 824-inch image, guess what? I'm only going to have 1 pixel per inch because I've only got 824 pixels. If I decide I want to have 100 pixels per inch, I'm going to have an 8.24 image. So the question is, how much resolution or how many pixels within an inch makes a good image when you print it out? And the rule of thumb is, would most people ask for a high resolution image? If you go to get your images printed by a professional printer, and they'll say, I want the image, I want the brochure you're creating in Photoshop, or the logo that you're creating, or the photos that you're having printed, I'm going to want those at high resolution. And usually what that means is 300 pixels per inch. Over 300 is a little bit of an overkill. Some people may ask for it. But for the most part, the rule of thumb is if they say high resolution, that means 300 pixels per inch. So notice within my document at 300 pixels per inch, the largest that this image, with the available pixels that are available to me, can print is only 2.747 inches by 2.05 inches. So not really big with the available information that's given. If I go down, I can do that, but I don't probably want to go down lower than 120 pixels per inch. I would say most inkjet printers can print at 120 pixels per inch, and to the naked eye, you're not really going to see that resolution, and it's not going to really jump out of you as low quality. But you don't want to go much lower at all from that. So somewhere between 120 pixels per inch and 300 pixels per inch is where you want to be, preferably at the top of that range. You'll notice at 120 pixels per inch, still the largest I can get my image with the available pixels that are there for me is 6.87. So with this image, 120 pixels per inch, 6.867 by 5.125 inches is the largest that this image should probably be printed without resampling this image or having Photoshop take a look at it and add some more pixels. So I'm going to choose OK. So let's say, you know what, I want this image larger than that. Maybe I want to print it by 10 inches. So if I go back to image size and I say, you know what, I want to make sure that this image prints at high resolution or 300 pixels per inch and I want 10 inches. I can't just hit 10 inches here wide because then I get lower than 120. I go below my low on pixels per inch. So what I'm going to have happen is I'm going to have to check resample image, and at that point I'm going to have Photoshop tell me, all right, you can add pixels up here. You can create new information. So I'm going to print this at 10 inches, and I want to get at least 120, preferably 300, so I'll add 300. Notice what's happening as I change these numbers down here. Photoshop is going to get ready to resample using interpolation to create new pixels. So I'll choose OK, and at that point my image blows up a little bit. If I double click, now I'm looking at it at 100%, much larger. Photoshop has created new pixels for me, and it's going to print out. So if you're going to want to add pixels or have resample your image and create new pixels, Photoshop is a good program to do this with. Although you probably don't want to add more than 30% of new pixels, because at some point the image is going to start to get blurry. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to take a look at this Mario image here, and I'm going to zoom in on it a little bit, and you'll notice that this Mario image is very small. If I open it up and go to image size on this Mario image, I've only got 16 pixels by 16 pixels. And if I have Photoshop say, okay, resample this image and create some new pixels for me, say I want this 300 pixels per inch and I want to print this by, 8 inches. Notice it created 2400 pixels by 2400 pixels instead of 16 by 16. If I have Photoshop do that, what ends up happening is it creates all these new pixels, but overall Photoshop can't really do magic, and all it did was just kind of blend and blur things, and it didn't really look that good. So that's a drastic example of what's kind of happening in my terrain image. At some point when you interpolate, when you create more than 30% new pixels, blurring is going to happen. Another way you might have heard resolution referred to is megapixels. And if you go to the Blackboard site and you take a look at one of the two charts that I have available to you, they kind of show how megapixels relate to pixel dimension or pixel resolution. And for the most part, I've been told that the word megapixel came from an easier way for folks to market cameras. It was a lot easier for somebody to say that that camera had 10 megapixels than for them to say it's got 3,872 by 2,592 pixel dimension. But you can kind of take a look and see how megapixels, and you may have a 10 megapixel and 8 megapixel camera, what resolution output in pixel dimension that gives you. And for the most part, what size that image can be printed at 300 pixels per inch or at 200 pixels per inch. So with those charts, you can kind of go through and see how those relate. You'll also notice that the resolution that I had on that terrain image was 800 and something, and it looked okay. If I jump back to terrain and go back to File, revert back to the originally saved image, take a look at it at 100%. It looks pretty good. It looks okay on screen, but not much resolution at all if we wanted to print. Remember when we go to image size and we looked at it at 300 pixels per inch, if I wasn't resampling, if I was just using those available pixels and choosing 300 pixels per inch, I'm only going to be able to print that image at about 3 inches by 2 inches. So not very large, 824 pixels. Especially as it relates to this megapixel chart, not even close to 3 megapixels. So another way that you can change the resolution or the amount of pixels that are in your image is with the crop tool. So the crop tool, the 5th tool down in the same bin as the perspective crop and slice tool, which we'll get to later in the class. If you choose the crop tool, you can take it and enclose your image, drag a marquee with it, and move it into a specific area so that I can crop my image to this specific area. And in order to complete that crop, I want to double click inside here or hit return, and I'll crop into that area of the image. Another thing that I can do is, I'm going to choose edit, undo crop. Another thing that I might like to do is, again, I'll take a look at my image size, and I had 824 pixels by 615 pixels. Let's say I wanted this image to be cropped square. If I change resample image, or if I check resample image on, and uncheck constrained proportions, that will allow me to size this image into a square. But the problem if I do something like this and size it into a square and choose, let's say, 3 inches by 3 inches, it's going to squish or squash my image to fit that aspect ratio. It's going to distort it. So I'm going to hit edit undo or command Z to undo that. So if I wanted to crop this image into a square, one thing that I might like to do is choose my crop tool, and then up here at the top choose 3 inches by 3 inches. And that way, as I crop, I can make sure that it crops into a square. And it doesn't distort my image, it just removes some of the area outside. Double click, and now I've completed that crop. I can also crop to a specific resolution. So over here, I can choose size and resolution, and I can choose 2 inches by 2 inches at 120 pixels per inch. So now, if I crop this image and hit return, and I go back to image size, I'll see that my image is 2 inches by 2 inches at 120 pixels per inch. One other thing that I can do with my canvas or my resolution is actually increase the canvas. So if I want to get more pixels around the outside, let's say I want some white space up here at the top to create some sort of caption, what I can do is go to image, and instead of image size, I can choose canvas size. And with that, I can increase the height. So if I increase the height by 4 or double it and choose OK, notice that I've got some space at top and bottom where I can add some other things to my image.